Good morning, everyone. My name is Ing Sing, and I'm your moderator for today's workshop. Today, we're going to talk about cybersecurity, a word that shouldn't be very new for us because cybersecurity has been things for us for the past 5 to 10 years. It's just that nobody really taking very serious note about cybersecurity. However, thing has been happening for these few years. People has been hacked either personally or company level also has been hacked. A lot of tons of data has been breached. So that's why today we are very happy that we managed to invite Mr. Chris, where he is an expert in cybersecurity, and he will share his knowledge to us. How do us as a IT professional, as a management, as a even individual personnel, how do we avoid or even how do we minimize the risk to be hacked? Okay, so a little bit about our speaker today, Mr. Chris. So Mr. Chris basically is our principal trainer from ALC, who is partners from InfoTrack, and he has roughly 30 years of experience in IT world. In various of industry examples like IT, banking, finance, software developments, right? But on the past 3 years, basically that he is focusing as a trainer to share more knowledge and consultant to companies in order they can avoid to be hacked in cybersecurity. Okay, so without further ado, Chris, are you there?
So I am Ing, thank you.
Okay, Chris, I would like to hand over the sections to you. You can start with your presentation.
Thank you very much. Just get that coming up. And just give it a pause for a minute just to make sure that indeed we have a shared screen. Thank you.
Yep, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, Ing. So I'm with ALC Security. I'm based here in Melbourne, Australia. Hello. And what I'm going to go through over the next 2 hours is some vocabulary, concepts, definitions, and things to think about as we go along. As Ing and his team are on standby to address any questions you have, but towards the end, let's say around about 11:40, something like that, maybe a little earlier, then I'll be over with the presentation and we can go and look at some questions which Ing will address. So got questions, put them into the chat, into the Q&A, and we'll address them. If we run out of time and aren't able to address your question, rest assured we will get to you afterwards. So we've got a few things to get through. This is all more about a conversation around knowledge and information, starting this core concept of cybersecurity. And there's elements of cloud security in here as well, but it starts the conversation going, making you think, and probably by the end of the presentation, might have more questions than answers. So let's take a look through some of these. Many of these slides do have a lot of detail, but I believe that this presentation is being recorded. So if you don't quite catch something, you can always get that recording a little later. You can play it back and pause on the screens or listen to the conversation. Whenever we think about security, information technology security, ICT, information and communication technology, we want to think about that information security, the data, what's important to the business, mission statements, criticality, finance, revenue, whatever it is, keeping that data secure. That's what we want to do. So information security is that overall globe aspect we want to think about. And within that there is cybersecurity. That doesn't mean that's a silo on its own with its own managers and that sort of aspect. Cybersecurity. This is what we want to think about. Security is for everyone. Yes, everybody's for security. So along the way, when you're doing this, now I've been in this industry for quite some time, and so, well, not me personally, but the CIA triad, that's what this is called, confidentiality, integrity and availability. That information has been around since the 60s, 1960s and onwards. So it's not new, it's been around for some time. So what we look at here, these are the three core pillars of security, everything you do in security related. How do I keep things confidential? How do I make sure that if the data changes, its integrity is maintained? And how do I make it available at all times? And all three is about making sure that only authorized people, process or technologies getting access to it. We want to keep information secret. We don't want the attackers to get hold of it. And even sharing information, we want to make sure these people, we share it with other departments, agencies, reporting to the media, that they've been authorised to receive that information. So we want to keep information secret, confidentiality. We want to maintain the expected and an accurate state of that information, it's the integrity. And last of all, our services, our information and services, they're up and running and they're available in a timely manner. So to do that with confidentiality, we think about limiting administrator rights, least privilege, no unknown devices that might create a problem about confidentiality and integrity. And when you're looking at something like a virtual private network, accessing sensitive company information, it's all compartmentalized. So if somebody's going to use a virtual private network to access the company or the data, that they're only doing so in the role or responsibility, their rights and their privileges. Now, that's your three core pillars, the CIA triad. Also, conversationally, is that there's a couple of other things. There's all of these, by the way, none of this has been invented. This comes from the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. It's called NIST, which is US federal government agency, and they're available for free. And the other source often is ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, which you probably have heard of. ISO 27001, many of you probably know what that is. So none of these terms or conversations are not just being invented by me, but they come from documentation that you can obtain and form it as part of your formal policy or part of that background information. How did you make that decision? Security, this is making sure the CIA, in regards to the CIA triad, in regard to cyber assets, is maintained. And how we do that, we look at authentication processes. So like passwords or PINs, a token, fingerprints and biometrics. And then with that, credentials being presented for authentication, they're then authorized to access the data. And don't forget, people, process, technology. There's three things to remember there. There's an aspect about non-repudiation. So with non-repudiation, we want a system to confirm the validity of something. Something happened, something occurred. Database was updated, input information, a web application was launched. We want to make sure it's valid. And we also want to make sure that there's an assurance, a security assurance about the data's origins and integrity. And last but not least, on the list is privacy. But I would invite you to think at the top, CIA triad, privacy, protecting personal identifiable information, names and addresses, identity card numbers, for me in the US, social security numbers, etc. like that. And also privacy around health. So there's an aspects for us. It starts to build a little bit, doesn't it? As such, to maintain those elements of security to cyber assets, we generally tend to think in three wonderful letters, GRC, governance, risk and compliance. And there's an aspect in here is about the oversight. Governance is the policies, the standards and procedures, guidelines and baselines. Risk,
Excuse me, Chris.
yes, sir.
Sorry to interrupt. So, Chris, is it possible they can on your camera because there's some requests from the audience that they cannot see you?
Oh, how embarrassing. Okay, just a moment. I'll pop my camera on. That should be there. There you go. Now you can see.
Hello. Yeah, by the way, this is Mr. Chris for those that just asking. So Chris, you may continue. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No problems. Thank you. So governance, this formulates your policies and standards and baselines, your procedures, your guidelines, etc. Risk, so the business has a vision or a mission. They've got goals, goods and services. So from that, they'll have their policies, how they'll offer that. But this is where security comes into it, is that from those goals comes an information security policy, amongst other things. And from that policy comes all the aspects of the things that we do. But with that, there's an element of risk involved in everything, right? From people, process and technologies, from controls like firewalls, antivirus, etc. There's an element of risk is involved where we have to assess it is how much risk is involved if we don't have any controls like firewalls or authentication or non-repudiation or any elements of the CIA triad, and how that might lead to data breaches, hackers and attackers. So we come up with a risk profile. Risk assessment is very important. We don't go in a lot of detail in this because there are other elements that can be discussed about risk with InfoTrek, of course, but there's an aspect in here about cybersecurity professionals. We assess the risk if we don't put those controls in place, if we don't have biometrics, if we don't have passwords or pins. What happens then? How would an attacker access the data? So it's about acceptable levels, and then compliance. Laws and regulations around privacy and data storage. There's the cloud comes into play here, doesn't there? There's a lot of conversation around that. Next up, part of your governance. This is your policy, your framework. Policies. Policies don't change much. Policy drives the business. Business drives the policy. The policy is often considered a framework, a collection of artifacts. What are artifacts? Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, audio files, images, movies, source code, repository of information. Those aspects are your artifacts. And everything around there, there's policy. You'll have a policy for passwords. All users will have a 32-character password. And then the password has uppercase, lowercase, special characters, and maybe numbers. So there's your policies, and then your standards about those attributes and characters. And they move on from down there. Risk management, yes, there's a lot to get through. Yes, be patient. Risk management effectively is you'll have threats, and a lot of this is subjective too. This is your own subject expertise in the industry or what you're hearing or reading. Threats are going to be very much subjective and sometimes inventive. Right? You think about threats, how would somebody access the asset? How would they get into the building? That sort of aspect. What happens if the firewall goes down? So you think about these threats and then you determine what are the vulnerabilities? If I don't patch an operating system, if I don't patch the applications, if users, well, particularly privileged access management and users, if that user provisioning, if I have no controls around that, what can happen? And then from that, you come up with likelihood. So this is sometimes subjective, but out of that, you do get facts and figures you can use. So I'll get to that in a minute. But risk is basically once you've got the threats and vulnerabilities understood, then you determine what's the likelihood that can happen. And you might do that like a survey question. 1, no, it's never going to happen, or I don't understand, to 5, it's very likely going to occur again in the next 2 or 3 days. So you just do a scale, 1 through to 5 typically is what happens, but you can go from 1 to 20. Just document those scales, that heat map you're going to create. And then you come up with the consequence, the impact or the magnitude. So for example, if an administrator clicks on a phishing link, what's the likelihood? Well, if 5,000 employees have got anti-phishing training, it's very likely that 1 or 2 individuals are still going to click on it. We're humans, aren't we? We're interested. Click on that. And then because they're administrator, now the attackers harvested those credentials and now there's a data breach. What's the impact of the magnitude? Bitcoins. Or maybe it's information in the press. Maybe it's something embarrassing, whatever the case may be. Consequence, impact, magnitude. It's not always about Bitcoin. Reputation, branding, and goodwill comes into play. So to help with the analysis, there are quantitative. These are facts and figures, finance and HR. The company's been in operation for many years. Here's our revenue stream. So we can determine, even down to the point that for every hour, the business can't access the database or sell goods and services. Maybe it's going to cost $1 million US. That's your subjective aspect you've come up with to form a quantitative. It's a finite metrics, etc. You've got semi-quantitative, taking a little bit of guesswork. Qualitative, this is absolutely, completely, very much personal, subjective. You've got no information. It's a brand new goods or services going that you're going to offer to the market. You have no history. So you take some best guesses about what might happen if you don't have controls like firewalls and training and education and awareness. If you don't have that, what will happen? Then a little bit over time, you'll start to build those metrics, and now you can be quantitative, which ties it much more into a more something that the business, the entity or the agency can translate to. Risk evaluation, this is what we call a heat map. Be that quantitative or qualitative, you'll come up with a heat map. And you see on the screen there, see the extreme, the one in purple at the top there, right in the top here? That requires immediate attention. Typically the board, senior level management, they need to be aware of that. So if we've done, just now we've done a risk assessment and evaluation, and we come up with, be it qualitative or quantitative, and it's going to be an extreme risk, then we need to address that. Put her at what controls can we put in place? Forward that to management, have a conversation. Conversation happens this afternoon, not tomorrow, not next week. It's extreme. As cybersecurity professionals, where do we fit in here? Medium. That's where we are. High, very high, extreme board, that's the board of directors, that's the managers. Low areas, monitoring and logging. Because remember, threats change and vulnerabilities change. So we keep that in mind with this heat map. How do you identify the risks? Lots of different ways. Security assurance in terms of vulnerability assessments. So you're looking for unpatched operating systems, unpatched applications, somebody whose role and responsibility, they shouldn't be an administrator, but they have that privilege. You look through those. Penetration testing. This is something that should be really looked into by everyone. Interested in a career? Penetration testing. In-house, many of the major banks have their own penetration testing teams. Red teams, you heard that phrase? The red teams simulate a cyber attack. So you have your penetration testing and your business impact analysis. This is where you ask questions of the business or process owners. What happens if you can't access the database for so long? What happens? Or even to the business, if we can't restore the goods or services to the market within a certain time frame, is that the end of the business? That's where that impact analysis comes in. And as I said, this is often a survey with the impact analysis. Security reviews. So for example, from that you can use auditing, looking at accountability. But with most security reviews, it's like we've got ISO 27001, if you've heard of that before. The information security management policies around that. If you're certified, you've got ways to measure that. You've got metrics that'll come out so you can determine, yes, we're maintaining our compliance and we're meeting our risk areas. We're addressing those. Code analysis. This gets important. It's been around for a long time. Commercial software or web applications, many of them still have vulnerabilities. Former software developer. There's vulnerabilities in place and you need to test. You either have it when, as a developer, you're testing it as you're writing the code, looking for dependencies, or now it's in a isolated or a sandbox area. It's not in production, it's isolated. And now you're running the application and you're looking for vulnerabilities. And even later on, even when it's in production, you're doing an aspect of runtime testing. So you might have a number of Windows 11 systems, or maybe Server 2019. Could be on-premise or it could be in the cloud. You still do your testing. For example, Microsoft Azure within Sentinel, Microsoft Azure Sentinel, you can go into the compliance area and you can check on for payment card industry. If you're taking payment card, credit cards, debit cards, check on that and it will automatically run through your system looking for any exposures to compliance with payment card industry. That's one example, there's others. Brainstorming, this is something we did in a former company I work with. We got around once a year, we feature functionality for our software or for our hardware. How can we improve it? Clients want us to do this. How can we do those use case stories requirements and then improve the product, thereby improving security? And secondly, we have a vulnerability in our software. How do we address it? How do we let clients know? And then workshops, such as what we're doing today. Identifying, having common conversations around vocabulary words, concepts and definitions and things to look at. And then finally with risk, I know there's a lot here. And some of this is not exactly entertaining, I know. Risk priority and treatment. So you'll have a risk register. And I do want to take a look at an example of a risk register very shortly. And then you'll have the business will so you'll have a risk register, you put your risks in there, and then you'll determine the controls to remove, to reduce, which is mitigate, or avoid the risk altogether, or the business to accept it. So they'll take that risk register, they'll look at that, and then they'll make those decisions. Yes, we'll update the firewall. Yes, we'll move to the cloud, whatever that case may be. So you can accept, mitigate. Another word for mitigate is reduce, reducing the risk to an acceptable level. Transfer, like a cybersecurity insurance policy or a service level agreement. Avoid, stop what you're doing. Got a new goods or service, but the risk is too great, then don't. Everything comes about as part of this strategy. So the three core pillars, CIA triad, security and privacy. You're looking at governance and risk. And now we get with part of the strategy, we're looking at compliance, laws and regulations. The Malaysian government have a cybersecurity strategy they launched in 2020. And there's within there is aspects about laws and regulations to be strengthened, enforcement. If you're aware of this, fantastic. If you're not, do go to the official portal, the NACSA, and you'll see the link in there that you can access it and look at the recommendations within 2020 to 2024. Now, you may not be management. We're just go and have a look. It's curious to look at it, and that way you can see, yes, we are doing these things, or that's something, a conversation I need to have with senior management. So there's a lot of external influences, in other words, that formulate the strategy. And one of the many ones in here is around data legislation. There is no one international law around data privacy, personal identifiable information like names and addresses, or patient health. No, it's all jurisdictional, very geographical. Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, in the US, they all have their own. And a recent new one in Brazil as well. These laws and regulations need to be considered as part of the strategy around the aspect about compliance. There are some standards and frameworks. There's a lot, right? I'm only just going to look at 3 today in very brief detail. I know I'm going through this pretty quickly, but as I said, it's recorded. You can go back over and look at the slides or the information, or even prompt more questions to come back with InfoTrek. ISO 27001 is used fairly widely around the world. It's an international standard. It recognised globally for managing risk and the security of information. Cyber assets, whatever they may be, data, it's internationally recognised. There's standardised requirements within there. And from those standardisations, there's a process approach for establishing, implementing, operating, monitoring, maintaining and improving your security of management systems. Lots of different aspects in here. A plan, do, check, act is a method I've used many times starting a new project. Plan, do, check, act. What are we planning for? How do we do it? How do we check it? How do we act upon it? So doing software, here's feature functionality. How will we do it? What are the code? What's the language? What's the framework we're going to do? Testing it and validating with our clients, with senior management. And then once it's in production, how can we improve upon it? Or how quickly does an incident come up, something about our software or our hardware, and how do we resolve it? So there's all aspects in there. If you're ISO 27001 certified, congratulations. If your business is looking at it, it's a long-term plan. It's not something that can be done in 3 months. So you do need to plan for a long-term aim to get towards that compliance. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's US federal government. You may not think, oh, why should I need to worry about that? Well, you don't need to worry about it, but it's freely available. ISO, like 27001, that comes at a cost. Anything from the National Institute of Standards and Technologies is free. And yes, you might think, well, it's for US federal government. Why should I look at that? Well, many of the frameworks are extensible, which means that you don't have to adopt the whole framework, but you can look at the framework to see and identify for any gaps you might have in terms of risk management and addressing cyber threats. So there's 5 functions you can read through there. It has a whole aspect about tiers, etc. And within the Malaysian government, there's aspects that they utilise of the cybersecurity framework from NIST. They don't have to adopt it all, but once you start going through documentation and aspects within Malaysian government documentation, or perhaps even your own documentation, you'll recognise elements that have come out of there. Again, something that's not just been invented. This comes from a risk management framework in the US. Very extensible. Highly encourage you to take a look at it. Some guidelines that you can use using that cybersecurity framework from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. You see all ways to identify. So with identify, risk management framework starts off with three things always: a hardware inventory, a software inventory, and data flows. Do you have that? Do you have a hardware inventory and a software inventory? Do you understand all the data flows, how data comes in, how data goes out, how the applications use that data? Where do they store it? Do you understand all that? But invariably, if you do hardware and software and inventory, a database of what you have, make, model, firmware, which vendor the software is from, the version, the build, all those aspects are in there, because this helps you, particularly when you look at vulnerability assessments, what systems aren't patched or up to date. Yes, so there's different ways to look at those. When we look at so that inventory of assets, you're identifying what do you go to safeguard, and how will you protect it? Controls that you put in place, firewalls, antivirus, anti-malware, training and education and awareness. You'll also look at auditing and penetration testing, see how this all comes. And now from those controls you've put in place, logical controls, physical controls, as I said, like a firewall or an intrusion detection system. This looks like malicious activity, alert, incident management, and how you respond to that. What are your checklists you've got for incident management response, or how do you restore business? And then finally, lessons learned. What didn't we do? What did we do good? Or perhaps even in terms of this is when we advised about a data breaches, this is when we communicated to our stakeholders, to our customers. So that's pretty much a very quick wrap up, just in terms of concepts. Now to look at some more interesting aspects, particularly around terminologies that get used. So remember, your CIA triad are your three core pillars at all times. You don't have an answer, think about what's being affected: confidentiality, integrity, availability. Don't forget security, privacy. So now people, process, or technologies want to present the credentials, the user ID, the system ID, the process ID to a system for authentication. What else comes with that user ID, process ID? Password or passphrase. Maybe it's something on a phone or a authentication generator. Those are presented to systems that authenticate. Here's the user ID. Here's the value of the password. So you know when you put in your password 123, hopefully you don't use password 123, that becomes what's called a hash value. I'll talk about that in a little minute. It's not encryption. It's a mathematical calculation, if you like. It calculates that, and the hash value looks up the ID. There's a match. So that password 123 is never passed in the clear. Should never be passed in the clear. So now credentials presented, authentication's granted from there, authorization. And auditing and or accountability, this is what formulates the AAA: authentication, authorization, and then auditing and or accountability. It depends who you're talking to. It's all about control over access, the right people, the right time, to the right type of data. Yes? And you're checking the identity and then looking at accountability. Different means of access control. Typically we come across as cybersecurity professionals. There's something you know. It's a password you've entered into the system or the user's entered. Or as part of a process or system ID, you've got a password or passphrase in there. So it's into the system somewhere. The word cognitive, this is something like the first address or the name of the school you went to. Here in other countries, your mother's maiden name, those sort of things. So that her name before she was married. We have their cognitive. It's only something you know. Only you know this. That's a type 1. Type 2, you might put in your password, and then you get a message from your phone, which has a PIN number on it. It comes from your phone. So that's something you have, is a phone. Or maybe it's a hardware token. It might be a little hard to see. Hardware token, yes, something like that. Some of you know this, or a digital certificate. And finally, type 3, biometrics. Like fingerprints, iris scans, facial recognition, that sort of aspect. So when you have two-factor authentication using two types, most of those might be a password and then something from the phone, that's been generated, or a PIN number. has been provided, pins provided to the phone. So there's something you know, your password, something you have. Multi-factor authentication is 2 or more. Now, it's always worthwhile to understand, do you have 2-factor or multi-factor? And then implementing either could be problematic, right? So you need to look at, can our we have outdated technology or legacy equipment or software? We can't put that into place. Let's think about some means to protect those, maybe something logical. We'll move them into a different network or some aspects like that. But this is about access control. So how do IDs present themselves and get authenticated and authorized? Most of us tend to think in terms of principle of least privilege. It's a conversation I have had with many clients over the years. Oh, we've got everybody's an administrator. Oh, that's wonderful, isn't it? Even if the role responsibility was a database administrator, using this principle, they don't have access to the entire database. Oh no. There might be a database administrator for users. That's all they get in the database, the user provisioning. Maybe they're the database administrator for the schema. That's all they have access to, nothing else. You control that. If you're not sure about it, minimum privileges, and then you can build that up over time from authentication authorization, what needs to be accessed. Particularly if you're in the cloud, those privileges must be thought about, and privileged access management. So we have identity, I call it identity entitlement, and privileged access management, connection to the roles and responsibilities, and then the skills and resources. There's a connection there. For example, in many of the places I visited, it was like, hi, Chris, welcome. Oh, you brought your own laptop with you. That's wonderful. There's a problem, isn't it? And then we weren't sure about your access rights. So we gave you full administration rights to everything we have. I'm a contractor. I'm not an employee. Right? So there's an element of trust in there, isn't there? And even if it's on premise or in the cloud, we need to think about reducing the access controls to the bare minimum, and then if required, you increase them as needed. But does that make sense? A database administrator doesn't get access to the entire database, or perhaps somebody who's a data custodian is another word. So they look after the day-to-day. There's aspects even then of the day-to-day that they don't get direct access to. It has to be escalated or elevated in a timely fashion. And once they've achieved that task, provisioning, whatever it may be, it's then removed and they're just back. Get that? Good. Logical access control implementations. These are some of them. Mandatory access control, the second one, typically seen in military intelligence or law enforcement. It's overseen by a group. It's more about the keeping it within the confines of a security clearance. So if someone has a secret clearance, they can't read anything top secret. They certainly can't write any documentation of top secret. And likewise, they can't write anything to the lower levels like confidential or public. And in some instances, the committee may even decide you have a secret clearance. You can't even read anything below that because that might change the way how you write the documentation or how you formulate it. So you don't want that. So that's mandatory. Most of the time in commercial entities, it's discretionary. There's a data owner that decide, they make the decision who has access to the data, how it gets controlled, labelled, and classification of the data. Do any of you do the labelling classification? Have you got documentation part of that? Standards, policies? Do you see where I'm going with that? How that starts to feed in? And don't forget about the CIA triad as well, and security and privacy comes into here. We have role-based, so this is about group rights. Reminder, you might have a database administrator group. That's great, and I belong to the database administrator group, but my skill and resources is on user provisioning. That's all the access I have to the database. So yes, I'm an administrator, only for user provisioning. And let's go down a little bit further in an attribute. The user provisioning, I can only create. I can't modify or delete, I can only create. Somebody else has that role of modifying or deleting, I don't. So you really minimize about those aspects. Why would you do that? Well, you think about somebody who's an administrator and they get phished. Now the attacker has those credentials, they're an administrator. But if you modify the access controls, and yes, they're administrator, but all I can do is create users, you're starting to limit the extent. So that's how you think about that aspect in there. Attributes, fine-grained, typically something about date, time, location. So for example, I'm a database administrator for user provisioning. I can only access that Monday to Friday, let's say 9 AM to 5 PM, Monday to Friday. If I try to access that at 3 AM on a Saturday, access denied. And all that information, everything I'm doing, auditing and accountability comes in. You see the connection. Auditing and accountability comes into play here. Yes. So that it sends out alerts. Chris, that's me, has just tried to delete users. I can't do that. That's not my access rights, but it's recorded. I try to do that. Creates an alert and incident management. There's some aspect in there. A lot of detail around this, and it's just very high level. When it comes to talking about access, you're talking about data. Data can be in any form or any format, classification or labeling. Yes, there's a data lifecycle. This data lifecycle applies not only to on-premise or to desktops and laptops, but also applies to the cloud as well. So think of this as more as a secure data lifecycle. You see the little telephone dial, create, store, use, share, archive, destroy. We call that says you sad, because you get this wrong and you will be sad about it as well. But to give you an idea, at create, the data owner has assigned the labeling or classification of the data at create. So when it gets to store, and it's stored at rest, is when it's being stored on disk or on tape, that classification labeling stays there, and at all stages, even when it's being destroyed, sunset, classification and labeling remains in place. Now, with that data lifecycle, how do you dispose of it? How do you destroy? How do you sunset the data? Now, hardware, software, not just data. Think hardware and software as well. Yes. So the data remnants comes about. What a wonderful word, remnants. And this is where, despite your best efforts to remove data, to clear it, purge it, or sanitize it, some data remains. Formatting? No. You can format a disk as many times as you like, and all it does, it removes the address location of the file. It's still on the disk. How do you address that? A better way? Got two physicals. You destroy it. That ends the argument about remnants, isn't it? You can destroy it. You can crush it. You can shred it, pour chemicals on it. There's a couple of other different ways of doing this. Or you can degaussing. Degaussing is strong magnetic fields are applied, and this works well for magnetic, like the spinning disk drives, or for tape media. It doesn't work for solid state, because solid state, nothing spins. You have to electrically exhaust solid state. What's better? Destroy. By the time you go through a process of degaussing, which could be expensive, would have been just cheaper to destroy it and replace it. The last two are logical, encryption and overriding, and this is in the cloud usually. So look at your service level agreement if you're not aware of that, and look in there about, is there anything mentioned about data remnants or data destruction? How is that addressed by the cloud provider? They've got all this hardware and software. They don't want to destroy that hardware. They want to reuse it. Or maybe that RAID array, redundant array of independent disks, that RAID array has data from other clients on there, and it's all compartmentalized off. So they may not be able to do it. So what they can do is typically overwrite. So what they might do is take non-critical text files. There's no information about them, about your data, your business or anything. It's just, it might just have a couple of words in there, but there's no connection or anything back to your data, and just write to the disk. Just keep writing until it's full. How would you know it's full? Forensics. Forensic software will help you determine that every cluster and sector on the disk has been overwritten with non-critical files. There's no information, there's nothing critical, no secrets. So the file's just got all A's in there, all B's or something, right? That sort of encryption. This is a little bit more expensive. What it means is you take, again, non-critical files, you can just make them up. Doesn't matter. And you'll encrypt those. and you write those encrypted files to the disk. But the encryption, which I'll talk about shortly, that encryption key, the secret key, you destroy it. So now on the disk, again using forensics, you've got all these encrypted files on there. None of them are critical, no sensitive information, and they filled the disk with these encrypted files. So now you can reuse that hardware, whatever the case may be, and there's different layers and more conversations around that. And of course, as a reminder, classification and labeling, this is done when data is created at the very beginning, and you have this classification scheme. It differs. For example, military intelligence law enforcement might use top secret, secret, official, official protected, classified, public. In a commercial entity, you might have commercially in confidence. So that could be like intellectual property, trade secrets. You might have something that's sensitive. So this could be sales figures, sales information, what the expectation are for quarters. So a data owner comes up with that. And the Malaysian government, as do other governments, have guidelines on that protective security around classification schemes, etc. So there's a lot of information around these. Logging and monitoring, this gets overlooked quite a lot, particularly in the cloud. But on premise, biggest issue, logging and monitoring, storage, comes at the cost of storage. And many businesses are happy for the logging and monitoring to occur locally on the endpoint, on the server, the desktop, or even the laptop, and then just rely on alerts coming off those systems. What if an attacker's got in there and they're deleting these files or modifying it? So the logging and monitoring, you have to have copies into a central area where it's encrypted, and that's part of your information and event management systems or your orchestration. Logging and monitoring, there's an aspect about application security as well. What is the application doing? Here in Australia, we had quite recent ransomware. And as it came about, it was because the businesses didn't have observability. They had no visibility into the application, the hardware or the software, as to what was happening. It wasn't coming into a central area where incidents were being created and teams were acting upon it. So it's very important, logging and monitoring. Threat modeling. It's a very interesting career. Threat intelligence, threat analyst, cybersecurity, threat analyst, threat intelligence, threat modeling. This can be very subjective. Microsoft Stride model has been around for a long time. 1999 for me on the Microsoft campus. It was all about a secure data lifecycle. You took the application and you mapped it out. You did your data flows. And then you worked out, what are the vulnerabilities? What if we don't insist on users being, every time they want to perform a task or a feature, when they click on it, they're being validated. What if we don't do that? If we don't verify every time? Here's a vulnerability. How do we address it? How do we reduce that risk or remove it? And then we test it, and then part of the documentation. So that's since 1999. There's other means around. Stride is one of them. There's others that are bound, and they've all got wonderful names. Octave, Pasta, Trike. So many of them. You familiar with any threat modeling? If so, it's worthwhile. If you don't, but you can see on this slide, we've got the CIA triads here: confidentiality, information disclosure, integrity, modifying unauthorized modification or data or code. And then we have availability. The service or the goods aren't always available. There's been disruptions, denial of service attacks, whatever that might be. And you can see the others about authentication, authorization, and non-repudiation. So some of the specific controls, logical controls to address, remember our CIA triad, the 3 core pillars? A couple of examples here for you in regards to application security. And these can be on-premise, these can be in the cloud. In the cloud, they're going to be virtual. How do you get them in the cloud? Well, you can build your own, you can go to the marketplace, or you can use a vendor. It's a very, very busy marketplace for these. But a web application firewall, and I know it's a busy slide, the web application firewall is only interested in web applications, nothing else. So if there's any data that doesn't apply to a web application, it just drops it. And of course, logs and monitors that. So if a web server in the front end requests information from the web application to the database. That sort of data flow is recognized, of course, looking for vulnerabilities, yes. But let's say somebody wants to put a domain name service update, not of interest, dropped. So only that traffic of interest. And conversely, at the very back end is the database, or maybe it's a domain controller. But in this case, it's database. And the database activity monitor, it's only interested in aspects about the database traffic. And you can confine it, even narrow it down. So in that database activity monitor, it will only accept traffic from the web application firewall. Anything else? Not interested. These come at an overhead, yes. I've typically seen about 2% of overhead, so you need to think about the effect on transactions and availability as such, yes. You find these in the cloud. Azure have these. They call it Web Application Firewall. Google Cloud Armor. Amazon also call theirs Web Application Firewall Activity Monitor, as do Alibaba. So in the cloud, you'll find these. These are not just on premise. They can be logically there. All right, encryption, very quick. Right. This requires almost an afternoon, so I'll be very brief about encryption. So first of all, yes, it says cryptography, but there's cryptology. Cryptology is the science concerned with data communication and storage, and keeping that secure. Now we've got cryptology. So now we get cryptography as part of that, which is the practice of keeping that information secure. Enciphering, deciphering, or encryption and decryption. One aspect in there. The other third one not listed here is cryptanalysis. Cryptanalysis looks at vulnerabilities in encryption, or sees the vulnerabilities in encryption and then makes it better or stronger. So it has an aspect in there. There's two forms, symmetric and asymmetric. Symmetric's very simple, low overheads, processing power, great for bulk data encryption, and it's one secret key. That's it. That secret key could be something that's securely agreed upon. It could be a phrase, trust but verify, a book or a movie, something two people want to agree upon, or you're sending within your email domain. You can define what that key might be and you keep that secret. So I want to send a message to Eng. We've already talked about what would be that secret passphrase we'll use. I'll write up the message, and in my application or manually with a command line or through the operating system, I'll say, yep, click the box for encryption, and I send it to Eng. Eng gets the message, and then his application, his system, or from a command line puts in that phrase, and now he can read the message. Wants to respond to me, writes up the message, uses that secret key, that passphrase. You get the idea from there. This is around for quite some time, and the very basis of this is behind what we have in Wi-Fi. So, and RC4, I don't want to go into too much more detail, but that was part of the web equivalency privacy. So part of cybersecurity, when we're doing Wi-Fi scans, we look for any wireless Wi-Fi systems that have wireless equivalency privacy, because that's easily broken, can be easily decrypted. We don't want that. So there's aspects, more conversation around that. It all started with a data encryption standard. No one should be using that these days, period. Triple DES, so the data encryption standard, started in the 70s. The National Security Agency in the US wanted all US federal government agencies to adopt it, and it came out with there, and there's a federal information processing standard. I know there's so much information here. That was proven to be vulnerable. Eventually we got triple DES, which is still used in legacy systems today, and information security manuals from federal government agencies usually say you need to update that. But that legacy system, it might be very difficult or expensive to do that. So you need to be thinking, what are your controls around any legacy systems that still use the triple DES symmetric encryption capability? Does that make sense? Triple DES, it's on the slide there. Nowadays, everyone should be using Advanced Encryption Standard, Federal Information Processing Standard 197, 128-bit. 128-bit, 2 to the power of 128. A bit is the power of 2. So 128 bits, 2 to the power of 128, to 56 bits, 2 to the power of 256. That's a lot, isn't it? Asymmetric is the other one. So you've got symmetric and now asymmetric. The difference with asymmetric is it uses a private and public key pair. When you generate an asymmetric public and private key pair, they're mathematically linked and you've got two keys. You share the public key. You keep your private key safe and secure. So if a system or people want to have asymmetric encryption for security, they share the public key, keep the private key all safe. These keys, the public and private key, distinct to the symmetric, are very large prime numbers. And as I said, they're mathematically related and they're paired together. They're not identical, but they're paired together. But please make sure you look at your controls and your policies around asymmetric is what you're using to keep your secrets safe. How is your private key? Keeping your secrets safe is very hard. Private keys, yes. As I said, there's a lot to go through here, right? Asymmetric cryptography, Diffie-Hellman, these two gentlemen, as well as Ravesh Shamir-Adelman, have been contributing to the encryption community for many years. So if you want to, your symmetric key, remember that secret key I talked about earlier? If you want to send that out securely, you'll use Diffie-Hellman, an asymmetric technique. RSA, Ravesh Shamir-Adelman, we typically see those when your web browser wants to connect to a website. There's an exchange of information. Part of that security is an RSA capability in there. Interesting, there's different bit levels. So today in your web browser, web server, it's probably using Ravesh Shamir-Adelman 2048 bit, 2 to the power of 2048. And if you're going into secret or top secret, those encryption levels increase even more. There's aspects in there, information security manual, etc., and guidance from federal governments or within your own commercial entity. Digital signature, there's a connection back to, remember, non-repudiation I talked about right at the very beginning, remember that? The non-repudiation part is a digital signature. And that means is that I can digitally sign that document and that shows that it came from me, it confirms. We address aspects of authentication, confirmation, and the message didn't change with the signature. What do I use to sign? I'm using my private key. I've got a token to sign my private key. So when Eng gets a message and we're using asymmetric, Eng has my public key. My public key is connected to the private key and it validates the token. It matches. There's a mathematical. But I don't send my private key and Eng doesn't have it. So we're compartmentalizing that, keeping it safe and secure. The last one, elliptic curve. This is the fastest of all the traditional asymmetric techniques. It's not as fast as symmetric. Symmetric is the fastest. But elliptic curve cryptography, we use it on our mobile phones or smartphones, and Bitcoin, we use that for that. Hashing is not integrity. For example, you see that 48 to Charlie, etc. That's in the slide there. So variable length moves to the hashing algorithm, and you see words and numbers. Letters and numbers. That's in there. Starts with 482 and ends in 1 echo 3. Well, that's the hash value of password 123. So if you have used, if I log in as Chris with password 123, the system generates that hash value. And there's lots of different hash value techniques, message digest, secure hashing algorithms. These are all configurable within operating systems, applications, or command line. And they always result in the same hash value. Password 123, this is an MD5, message digest 5, always arrives at the same value. So that your user ID and your hash value of your passwords in the database, not the password in clear text, the hash value. But this is not encryption, it's for integrity. It's a means of when the message or the data was created and then sent, there's a hash value. So when it gets to its destination, the hash value is compared. If the hash values don't match, something went wrong, something corrupted, or maybe there was an attack. These are some recommended algorithms. Around the world, these are the standard 5. You see that Suite B reference? I'm sorry, I didn't elaborate on that part there and here. Suite B is the National Security Agency, the US federal government. Their Suite B is what's adopted pretty much worldwide by many countries. And they have these aspects in here. there's if you just put NSA, National Security Agency Suite B, into Bing or Google or your browser, whatever it may be, and you'll come up and you look for the NSA Suite B and you'll see the recommendations they make in there. They should be what's in your policies, what's in your standards. Look at that, almost on time. So I'm just going to take a quick little look at something. Let's see. So first of all, if you don't mind, I'm going to stop presenting. I'm going to show you two things, what a risk register looks like, and then using the attack navigator for your threat intelligence, threat modeling, whatever it may be. So I'm just going to stop presenting there. So now you see a much bigger appearance of my face. And instead, I'm going to come over here. I'm going, excuse me a minute. I've got too many screens here. That's my problem. So there's the screen there, and I'll share that one. So for example, I'll just pause for a minute and somebody can tell me if you can see that share screen and it's readable. Yes. So for example, we might have done a risk register and we've got all these assets on premise, in the cloud, bring your own device policies, employees. If there's a bring your own device policy, these are owned by employees, a smartphone or a mobile phone, but they're going to use them in the business. Then the part of a bring your own device policy should be looking at the risk of employees using this, because we've got to think about it sometimes, isn't it? We've got, in terms of awareness of cybersecurity, we know these things. But what about people that aren't necessarily aware of that? And so they bring their phones or their smartphones and they're taking pictures or they're tapping on things and how that will affect it. It's a good conversation to take up with Infotrek, by the way, about how they can help you and address social engineering, phishing attacks, etc. So from here, you've got through this. Where do you get this from? We have conversations, business owners, process owners, what you see yourself, a lot of conversations, a lot of survey information. And then from here, I picked on one asset. This is intellectual property. As an example, you've got a little trademark in here. So there's a trademark application underway. And I've done a risk where there's no protection, no intellectual property protection. It hasn't been that asset, the treat me right intellectual property, the trademark for it, hasn't got any legal or financial protections around it. So what's the likelihood that a competitor could use the same thing? There could be confusion, quite likely. And what's the result? Very high. Who addresses very high? Senior level management. And now as a result, I'll think, all right, I want to protect my company's intellectual property. I'll put some legal in there. I'll have in-house legal or a third-party legal, and they'll help me get that asset, that intellectual property, for example, get that asset registered through Malaysia, or Singapore, or Australia, New Zealand. Where do you go? Intellectual property offices around the world run by federal government agencies. So there's the Malaysian Intellectual Property Office, run by the Malaysian government. So there's lots of policies and standards around that. Now with that protection in place, my risk has changed. It's unlikely to occur. Yes, it's possible for a competitor to start using that, but now I've got protection. I can now sue or litigate that competitor. So as a result, it's now a medium risk. Has it gone away? No. Medium risk is for you and I. We use logging and monitoring aspects. Maybe the law firm, they're browsing the dark web, or they're reading the papers and looking for those aspects in there. And then we might also do a classification and labeling. So this ties into who do you want to give access to this intellectual property? Well, it should be legal people, yes. Senior level management. Anyone else? Maybe not. So as such, you have this confidential aspect in here. You think about restricting it, right? So that's, sorry, those with a need to know, or let's do this, those with a need to know and need to use. Privileged access management, yes. And then confidential private, you can come up with your own. These are just some examples I've used. You can see there's some other aspects in there about content and context, top secret. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, so you're most definitely going to rewind the presentation and look at some of these. All these information, you can find them on the web. maybe you're already using this. If you're a government agency, there's an aspect of looking back to information security manuals, etc. If you're a commercial entity, this information is in either an ISO, International Organization Standards, ISO 27001, lots of different aspects. 27001 is not the only one you can come up with. So there's that one. And the last one I'm going to do for you is using MITRE. So I don't need that anymore. I can drag this over here. Minimize that. No, minimize it. It doesn't want to work. Okay, let's minimize that. And then let me prepare this slide area over here. I like to see these things occur as I go through it. Right, now I can share it. Now they've got it all prepared. There's only so much you can prepare beforehand. So this is I know it's a little hard to see. Right? MITREattack.org. So this is a US company. They're based on the east coast of the US. And they do, one of the many things they do is they provide common vulnerabilities to the public domain. So your security operations center or incident management have signed on to that and they get this for free. I know it's a little hard to see, isn't it? All underneath. Let me make this a little bigger for you. These are tactics, techniques, and practices that attackers use, right? So there's quite a few in there. So how do we use this? Well, we go into matrices. I think it's matrices. And we can see that there's the enterprise for Windows, the Mac Linux. We can see it in there for the cloud. We've got mobile and we have industrial control systems. So there's lots of, if you've got interest, you know. What we do over here on the right-hand side, we go to the attack navigator and I click on that. And what the attack navigator does, apologies, when we click on that, we can create layers. So we can choose which layer we want. I'm just going to make it simple and do an enterprise layer. So now I've got, here's all the tactics, techniques, and practices from MITRE. This is what they get from hardware and software vendors and from their own teams. So it's not just made up, it's actually based upon examination of aspects in there. So how do we use this? Well, I've got this Sherlock Holmes right up here. Okay, that might be a little hard to see. What I call the Sherlock Holmes magnifying glass. And we'll click on that. And I'm going to put in one of the ransomware groups. So I've got down here threat groups. I'm going to pick software because I want to see how they do it. Right? And I'm going to select it. So now that I've selected it, now that I can do that, I'm then going to do a color setup. Apologies. I can minimize that. And now I've got technique controls are now available to me. So once I pick software groups, I can now do the controls. And now I can see it much easier. Look how detailed this is. Let me zoom back out. Let's get rid of that color. There's a lot in here, isn't there, to unpack? Yes, there's a lot. But at a glance, you can see how a ransomware group, how they get into your system, the initial access with a drive-by compromise, and then what happens after that. So this helps you in turn. You can see each of these have a little number. Zoom back in again. So for example, the drive-by compromise. There's a technique 1189. You can search for that within MITRE. And here's the drive-by compromise. Definition, how do they do it? The user who's been socially engineered visits the website and so on. Here's the procedures. APTs, by the way, usually nation states. G for groups. S is for software, etc. Lots of look, that's a lot, isn't there? Mitigations. How would you reduce the risk of this? How would you detect it? So MITRE have all these aspects for you. This is well worthwhile. Talk to Infotrek about this. They'll be more than happy to help you with that. But you have that, and then you can give it a layer name if you like. Right. So now you've got one layer, and now you can create a new tab, and you move on from there. There's a lot more to do here, but you know, time is an essence here. So I'm just going to pause for a minute while I move these out of the way, so I can go back to the presentation. Now, as I said, questions are at the end. We're doing well for time at the moment. Ing, if I may, we are doing well for time. Is that right?
You are.
Yep. Actually, that we have another 45 minutes to go. So, do you want to take a break, or we can continue with some demo from your side?
I'm kind of happy to continue on.
That's good.
Reason being, if I continue on, I'm more likely to finish the content, and then we can get to questions because everyone
Yep.
wants to get to their questions.
Then,
How's that?
okay, that's good. Then let's continue with your sharing. Then let's pause for Q&A after you share all your content.
Very good. Thank you. Everyone's good with that? Okay. So let me come back to here. Go. So now we've got 2 more domains to go. Security controls, and then I want to get to looking at things like education, training and awareness and some threats within Malaysia, etc. So again, continuing the conversation, building this vocabulary with you. So this forms the basis of the vocabulary. So later on, when you're having conversations with InfoTrek, you've got information that you can have a common conversation with or focus in on areas of interest that you need some more information or assistance from. Lots of controls in here, including cloud. Controls can be physical, administrative, or technical. And these can be manual or automated. And these will exist whether on-premise, if they're in the cloud, or even if on your laptop, or perhaps even on a smartphone, mobile phone. Controls. There's logical aspects of controls, firewalls, antivirus, intrusion detection, or the physical controls, buildings, a swipe card or a turnstile or a man trap or something like that. Fences, what I usually like to say, gates, guards, guns and dogs, right? Yes, and fences and things like that. So these controls are physical, administrative or technical. So remember that down pat, P-A-T, physical, administrative, technical. Under each of those, and they can be automated or manual, you have detective controls, preventive controls, corrective controls, a lot of detail here, recovery, and then compensating and deterrence. So there's more conversation around that. Again, with InfoTrek, of course, if you want some assistance with that. But this is creating these controls and these policies, procedures. Detective controls are your policies and procedures. Passwords and passphrases, for example. How does someone get in and out of a building, even in an emergency? Preventive controls, awareness and training. An example of this workshop, this is a preventive control. And then corrective, an example, you've got anti-phishing training in the office. And now from that training, you can get metrics, you can get records for quality. It takes 5 minutes. It would be interesting to learn, wouldn't it? If employees are only taking 1 minute to do that anti-phishing training, is that still effective or something you need to look at? So we have these controls, but this supports the creation of a defense in-depth strategy. You've got all these aspects. You see the physical, administrative. After that is the technical, which can be physical or logical. Administrative, education, training and awareness. Roles and responsibilities, skills and resources. Physical, there's my gates, guards, guns and dogs. Fences, intrusion detection. We have electrified fences, keep people away. We have motion sensors, cameras, lights. Then here we are, that's the building, so there's a building perimeter. And now we have within our data center, on premise or in the cloud, we have a perimeter. So we have, how do we protect that perimeter? How do we control the access of data in and also outbound? We've been doing firewalls for many years. Some of the misconfigurations I've seen as all inbound traffic is being examined, policies and rules, but very little rules in the way of outbound traffic. It's interesting, something to think on. But we have the perimeter. We think about secure email gateways, secure web gateways, web application firewalls, etc. So all these make up this defense in depth. I'm just making sure there's nothing else in there. Endpoint, whitelisting. It's called allow listing. So it's what software is allowed to be used, but you can also look at it from a web application. Is Chris allowed access to that website? If he is allowed, then grant the access and logging and monitoring. If Chris is not allowed access, block and create an alert, logging and monitoring. So there's a lot of statements involved in there. application patching, operating system patching. How many of you have operating system patching? Is it automated? Do you do patch Tuesdays? Or perhaps you're only doing it once a month? Vulnerabilities to think about. Same for application patching. And also within the applications, often there are pre-assigned users, aren't there? So you can harden that, and now with privileged access management, start to segregate, control those aspects of what the users are doing within the application. File integrity management, you can see those in there. The idea here is that if should any one of these control fails, ultimately, it should not lead to a data breach. There's a lot there, isn't there? Data at rest, it's encrypted. Good. So if somebody does, if an attacker is successful with a data breach, and then they do exfiltrate, they download the data, well, it's encrypted. What's the possibility, or I use improbability, that they'll be able to decrypt that? Well, advanced encryption standard, probably unlikely. But you know what? The attacker could get lucky on that first pass, that brute force dictionary attack. Brute force, password 1, password 12, password 123. Brute force, you just go through the dictionary. You go through those aspects, and a dictionary, don't forget, not only is there English, there's Malay, there's Chinese, there's German. It's not all about one language when it comes to a dictionary. So we're looking at this defense in depth, all these controls we put in place. In order to address that, we talk about the OSI model. Yes, I know. It's not exciting. This is technical. But for those of you, the OSI model's been around for a long time in the US, in the UK, and in France as well. So either you'll be talking about the OSI layer where protections are in place, but the OSI model, its purpose was to help network engineers determine how to troubleshoot. So the users can't get onto their browsers. You start with the physical connections, the cables, and you work your way up there. That was all the aspect in there. Each layer has their own different use. And then we have the TCP/IP, the Transmission Control Protocol, Internet Protocol layer. And there's a 4-layer here. There's also a 5-layer. But you can see here later, and you'll probably want to look at this later, the different attack vectors as it applies there. So things to address, in other words. This has been around for a while. The OSI model looked at OSI layer in 1984, but previously it was used by federal government agencies for that. So there's a lot of ISO, International Organization Standard 7498. That's where you go to look at this, to look at, have we got the appropriate policies and standards in place? Let's look at this documentation. Have we got this in place? Have we thought about those aspects? The model itself, this is very busy, but we're all familiar with the Internet Protocol, IPv4 and IPv6. Yeah. This is so you'll have a network card which has a physical address on the network, and that's assigned a logical address, which is the IP address, 192.168.0.1. I don't want to go too technical here, but there's 4 protocols, and each of these needs to be addressed for risks, compliance, laws and regulations, and also for governments with security policies. Some common flags. I know this is technical. Some ports though, ports that by definition, so on a firewall, for example, FTP, port 21, and Telnet, port 23, are turned off by default. Remote desktop protocol, what's that, 3389, something like that? Sometimes that's turned on. Port 22, goes out to most people use that for the cloud connection for administrating. Again, comes back to my firewall misconfiguration. Traffic coming into the network, port 22, rules around that, policies. Going back out of the network, most of the time no. And sometimes this is what attackers utilize as command and control, is to use port 22 because it's allowed in some cases. And that's how they get the data out. It might take them 6 months to copy all your data. Doesn't matter, it takes 6 months for ransomware. IPv4, you can look at this wonders of this slide later. I'm not going to go into great detail, but here I've used an example of converting a logical IPv4 address into binary. Binary? No, not exciting. Okay, not a problem. But understand is that there's a format to IPv4 and to IPv6. They have standardized formats to that. And again, you need to address this not only for risk, but also incident management and business continuity. It starts to tie into here. So many businesses still use IPv4. There's a move to IPv6 because there is some more security around there can address risk. But how do you adopt IPv6? Do you know where all your data is? Data flows? Are you sure you want to go to IPv6 or will it expose any vulnerabilities into it? A lot of technicals around there. Wireless, we have wireless and Wi-Fi. So wireless, in my sense, means your 3G, 4G, 5G. That's wireless. Wi-Fi networks, your 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. Wireless fidelity, and then there's different aspects in there. It's worthwhile to note WEP, wide equivalency privacy. No one should be using that. It's easily, the bad guys, the attackers, they know this, they can crack that quite easily. So instead, what are we using today? WPA2, Wi-Fi protected access 2, and it has PSK as a public shared key. We have the advanced encryption standard, and the CCMP is a counter mode cipher block chaining. I know, counter mode cipher block chaining. It's an aspect of using a 128-bit symmetric key from in there. Right. Firewalls, my favorite. Eng has already warned me not to talk too much about firewall. I get onto soapboxes about this, but firewalls, there are different technologies and they have different, all usable within your environment. So you might have a next generation firewall, the latest and greatest at your perimeter. And then for each business zone or domain, you'll have different firewall technologies. Remember web application firewall and database activity monitoring? There's specific application layer firewalls. Packet filter, that's what started it. Packet filters are still around today. And in their simplest forms I've seen is a rule which says on a router, if the data coming in wants to access this port and it's coming from this IPv4 address or going to this IP address, allow or deny. That's it. It's around allow or deny. There's the basis of the packet filters. Much more complicated. If you've got firewalls, look to your vendor. Palo Alto, Microsoft Azure if you're in the cloud. Documentation, lots of it in there. Special, these are what called sensors, intrusion detection and prevention systems. These are firewalls, but they look at malicious activity. And some of the latest ones use artificial intelligence. So they build up information about user, network and data, the behavior, what it normally looks like. So when they see something behavior that's outside of those parameters, those thresholds, alerts. Detection systems can only detect and send you an alert. Prevention systems detect and prevent, and they can do things with scripts or policies. They can do that automatically. So if it sees that unusual network activity to the database, for example, now it can lock the database off, isolate it, make it virtual, sending out alerts, incident management, business continuity, risk management starts to come into play. But it sees unusual activity and now there's some scripts that you've put in place. You've approved those scripts, which updates the firewall, moves the database into a safe area. Lots of aspects in there that you can do around there. Endpoint protection. A lot of endpoints these days. It's not only about servers and desktops and laptops. Routers, switches. Got a lot of things that are attached to the network. We've got smartphones. We have tablets. Anyone got a Fitbit or an Apple Watch? Uses Bluetooth, doesn't it? So we have an aspect of connectivity that we need to be aware of. Televisions, microwaves, body cams, dash cams in the cars. Lots of different means. So we need to think as cybersecurity professionals about endpoint detection and response systems. If you need to know more information, by the way, InfoTrek can assist you with this. But it's a means of, again, looking at user, network and data activity and behaviours and being alerted to that. Part of endpoint detection and response, these are a little old nowadays, so extended detection response systems come into play. These typically have artificial intelligence. They analyse the nature of the threat. giving your security operations center or your incident management team additional information to analyze the nature of that threat and to act appropriately upon that. It can contain a threat. You can write the scripts. You can approve scripts to contain areas, put them into isolated areas in the cloud even. You can do this on premise. You can do this in the cloud. You can put these onto your laptops. So as your executive or your employees travel with these laptops, there's detection and response. There's policies to protect those aspects in there. Cloud computing. I teach a 5-day course, a certified cloud security practitioner. So what I'm going to do is compress the 5-day course into just a few slides. So what you've got is what's called bare metal, for example, and you'll install a hypervisor. Hypervisor is a command line. Anyone like command line? Yes? Okay. You'll install this command line hypervisor. Command line, which means there's a lot of reduced vulnerabilities have been addressed just through the command line. And it creates this virtualization layer and shares all the resources of that bare metal, that server, the compute, the CPU and memory, the storage capabilities and the networking. All that becomes a resource pool to address the 5 characteristics: broad network access. How much bandwidth do you want, for example? Elasticity means about auto scaling and load balancing, for example. I've just realized there's one missing on here. Rapid elasticity. I'll update this slide and I'll come back when I'm answering questions, and I'll come back, but it should be rapid elasticity should be got on-demand self-service. Measured service, if you'd like to write that down. My apologies all. Quality assurance should be measured service, which means facts and figures and metrics that you can obtain. It's on the next slide, measured service, right? And on-demand self-service, you don't have to open a ticket and say, I want to create a virtual machine. You have the access to it. You create an account in your cloud provider, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Compute, or with Alibaba, or even with Oracle or IBM that are private cloud providers. You can access those with an account, and now all the resources are available for you to do that. Measured service, there's the missing one. I'll update this slide and quickly come back to it a little later. But they're the 5 compute characteristics. There's a little link down the bottom, NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, 800-145. And ISO have just updated 22123. It's not on this slide. ISO 22123, vocabulary words to address this as well. So ISO certified, there's an ISO 22123. Different cloud models, infrastructure, fastest way for you to get goods and marketing, infrastructure as a service. All the cloud providers have it, public or private. You're going to install your own operating system, going to get it from the marketplace, or you're going to export it from on-premise and use it in the cloud, that exported image of that physical machine, and install it in the cloud and use that as the basis to build your own infrastructure as a service. Platform as a service, typically used by developers. Microsoft Azure usually gets the nod for this. And what it is, well, developers don't want to spend time building a system, installing the operating system, patching it, hardening it, removing services they don't want, and then putting in the application. No, time, not important to me, says the developer. So instead I'll use a platform as a service, which has got all that running already. It has the language and the framework I need to test the application. Some might call this containers or serverless, has the language and framework, and a developer will drop the latest code, which triggers, because it's monitoring for new files, triggers platform as a service that launches a container to test the application. And you can manage all the containers using Kubernetes, K8, with that aspect. Software as a service, fastest to provision, but you've got the least amount of control. Office 365 is an example of software as a service. Salesforce, SolarWinds, platform as a service, Heroku. These are ones I'm familiar with. And infrastructure as a service, as I said, you're installing your own or you're building or importing it. Got through 4 different cloud models, public, community and private. Hybrid, so for example, on premise you have a private cloud, ESX perhaps, VMware ESX, or maybe it's Microsoft Hyper-V in your own private cloud on premise. And then for purposes of high transactions, end of month activity, CPU thresholds, you'll have a hybrid system where you use a public cloud model. So when you reach those thresholds and you need extra load balancing, auto scaling, you use a public cloud model and you utilize typically the infrastructure as a service. Launches virtual machines, addresses your transaction requirements, and gracefully shuts them down and deletes them as necessary. More about that information. InfoTrack again. Yes. Shared responsibility model, very important. The blue is for you. That makes sense to you. So if you've got Office 365 software as a service, your concern should only be about the people, data, and governance. Anything else, Microsoft keep it updated for you. If you've got your own VMware on premise, it's all your responsibility, everything. You can see the differences, how the responsibility changes. Now, this is a non-vendor model, but if you do accreditation or certification with Amazon, Azure, Google, Alibaba, they refer to these, but they have their own terminologies. Are there risks in the cloud or virtualization, either on-premise or in the cloud? Yes, there are. Very busy slide. I'm not going to go through each and every one of them. I'll probably call out aspects of data remnants. You remember that? Data eventually has to be sunset. How do you deal with that in the cloud? Data retention. The longer you hold the data, either on-premise or in the cloud, the more likely a new law or regulation is going to affect that retention. And data sovereignty, that's about where is it, the data you're collecting it from. So here we are in Australia collecting data about Malaysian citizens or permanent residents. So Malaysian laws come into play and we take that data and we store it in Australia. So now Australia laws comes into play. So now we've got two countries, Malaysia and Australia. We need to be aware of those aspects in there. In the cloud, or actually anywhere, web application, there's a non-profit organisation called OWASP, Open Web Application Security Project. This should be the source of information for your developers doing web applications, whether it's going to be on-premise or in the cloud. Great source. I've used this before, 2013, and then they updated 2017. Now just 2021 they've updated. You can see how things move around. How they determine this, they get surveys, information security operations centres, federal government agencies, etc. Websites are hacked, aren't they? Very popular to hack a website, either to deface it or to insert malware. So a victim comes along and is unaware that this is a bad website. They've clicked on a link, and now anything in that website, it looks like it's, the vendor they're looking. It is, the news, the straight news, the Malaysia straight news. Looks just like it. But there's a few things that may not be right, and they click on a link, launch malware. Part of the social engineering training, worthwhile to take up with InfoTrack. But here we are, developers, have a chat, talk to InfoTrack, how they can help you with your app, with your existing or your next security project. This is all about testing, about tools, testing it when it's in development for vulnerabilities, for those aspects in there, libraries, dependencies, and now you test it in a secure environment, isolated, sandboxed area. So now you're running the application. And then before it goes into production, you're in that pre-production area, vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, auditing, you're doing those aspects, and now it's in production. You're looking at to minimize the risk. You do these through the tools from there. That was fast, wasn't it? Got a lot to unpack. And now some specifics about business continuity incident management. So as cybersecurity professionals, we typically have a number of things to think about. Remember the core pillars: confidentiality, integrity, availability, security and privacy. We need to think about governance, risk and compliance. All this ties into business continuity, incident management, and I've already talked about risk management. So I've got the CIA, got security and privacy, GRC, governance, risk and compliance, and then business continuity and incident management. So if we're going to recommend a control, an update to the firewall, or maybe some new anti-malware, how that will affect business, because there may be business disruptions when you update the firewall or deploy the anti-malware, for example. your employees might have training and awareness on it. And as a result, things go wrong, how that affects business operations, and as a result, incident management. So there's a lot of tie-ins in here to think about. Business continuity, very much long-term and strategic. Over the years, most of the time, in some countries, I've seen long-term strategies for 3 years or 5 years. In other places, I've seen generational as it goes from grandfather, father to son, but it's very much long-term and strategic. These are the good services we want to continue to offer, and in a year's time, we have a new goods and service to come up with. As a result, there could be disruptions to business operations, so we need to have a recovery plan, disaster recovery. So that's going to be short-term tactical. It could be down to minutes or hours, how we address that. We develop and prioritise these plans based on the business needs and objectives. And you're doing that to ensure the business continues to operate before, during, and after a disaster event, cyber attack, a disruption, a phishing, ransomware. Top level management support, got to have that. It's essential. And out of the embedding it, why do you put it into day-to-day practices, embedding the processes, so that if there's a change in policy, it immediately raises concern about business continuity, disruption to operations, and a disaster recovery plan. 5,000 employees walk out on the job. Power goes down. There's a pandemic. There's flooding. There's I was going to say hurricane. There's a cyclone, or maybe there's a monsoon. So there's structural, adversarial. There's also environmental. There's aspects we need to look at, sources of threats, and tie them back to the continuity for business operations. We need a solid plan for this. Communicate. Everyone knows about continuity, business continuity and disaster recovery. Roles and responsibilities, skills and resources come into play here. How do you do that? Lots of standards and frameworks. Here's just some of them. The top one, BCI, Business Continuity Institute, Good Practice Guideline. It's a UK firm. A lot of entities use that around the world, federal government agencies and commercial entities, and they have their guideline in there. I'll talk about the 6 practices that they do. There's some ISOs. There's NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technologies, SP, Special Publication, 834. That's free. You don't have to be a federal information system or an agency, Bureau, Department, or Commission in the US. Anyone can use that. Disaster Recovery Institute, it's the world's oldest non-profit. They're more about education and accreditation, not as a means for compliance. ISO 27001, anyone? Anyone certified? ISO 27001? Annex 17.1 for your business continuity and management of that. 17.2 in 27001. Here's the UK firm, and a reminder is that they have a policy and program. So this relates to how that policy will be implemented, how it's controlled and validated, and then embedded day-to-day activities, culture, behaviour, skills and resources. Then you have 4 technical practices, and the very first one is business impact analysis. So you're going to determine the assets or even the businesses or departments, any resources. What's the criticality? How critical is it? So that when you come to restore operations, we need to have the database back. In order to do that, we need physical or virtual machine, an operating system, patch it, harden it. Hardening, it's where you remove unnecessary services and or users from an operating system or an application. How do you know to do that? Hardware and software vendors provide that documentation, as do the cloud vendors. Lots of places to go, you get this, yes? And then we have the other technical practices that are in there. Metrics, particularly when you get out of backups, you know how long a backup took. So you know how long it's going to take to restore the data, and you add one more thing into it, work recovery time. You've restored the data, let's test the integrity before we make it available again. There's 2 of the 3 in the CIA triad, aren't there? If you're running a data center on premise or in the cloud, or if you're accessing the Malaysian government GovCloud, for example, there are standards around that, and there are different tiers. So a tier 2 is the minimum standard for on-premise. Tier 4, minimum for a cloud vendor. So there's aspects in there. The Uptime Institute, they've got all documentation around there about basic sites, redundant, concurrently, and fault tolerant. If you're interested in more about how do we test and validate our data center, how does it measure up, Infotrack can help you with this. Different recovery options, recovery time. How long does it take me to restore business? Right? You've got your backup to restore from, test the integrity. So if the backup took 4 hours and you restore it, let's say it's 4 hours to restore, and you need another hour for integrity, that's 5 hours. That's your recovery time, it's 5 hours. The business says that's not tolerable. We have to have recovery of that database within 15 minutes. You can't do it from restore. You now have to have a duplicate or a mirror site. Clustering, high availability, some technology like that to make it redundant. Switches over and switch back. You can see the different levels of recovery time. It's about how much time it takes. RAID, means the time over my course of my career, my clients say, yes, we have backups, we use RAID. I have to then have a conversation. It's not a backup, it's about redundancies, and there are different RAID levels. Cloud vendors typically use RAID 6. RAID 6 is RAID level 5+1. So they're doing parity and mirroring. Lots of documentation around what does that mean, how does it do it. It's certainly worthwhile to consider it from a risk perception, but also look at it from a technical perspective as well, if that technically meets the requirements of the business. Remember, availability and integrity in this case. Recovering systems, lots of guidelines in here. You've got a backup vendor or you're a backup vendor yourself, what you advice or consulting you provide to clients or get from those vendors, lots of documentation around there. Physical or logical, on-premise, in the cloud, busy marketplace. Lots of places to see in there. Test and exercise. I can't see you, but how many of you have a disaster recovery plan? When was the last time you tested it? Was it recent? And did it work? So we have to do this validation. We've put this business continuity disaster recovery in place. We have to test it. We have to validate it. It needs to be kept up to date. So there's aspects in there about lessons learned. Information event management systems. This refers back to logging and monitoring. And a SIEM, these have been around for a long time, again, on-premise or in the cloud. Nowadays, you're probably more likely to use an automation response system. Again, these are physical or logical, on-premise or in the cloud. Certainly encourage you, when it comes to a SIEM or a SOAR, have a talk to Infotrack. Here at ALC, we also have courses around business continuity and those aspects of management of these systems as well as cloud. Incident response process. This is from National Institute of Standards, special publication 861. Another place for you to go and look it up. Just do a search. It's free. It's available. It does require a structured approach, yes. So you create checklists. Don't work from memory. If you're an incident management team member, create a checklist. Because if something hasn't worked, it's a lessons learned which updates the checklist. If you're doing it from memory, you may miss a step or be unaware of a new step. And there's different processes. You prepare. What happened? We've got an alert. Unusual user activity detected. All right, let's collect that information. Let's analyze what's happening. Is this actually an error, misconfiguration, or actually an attack? Then how do you contain and eradicate it? Maybe there's some business operations that have to be recovered. So you have to understand it. And as an incident team member, you need to look at incident response. So you need to have a lot of skills here, and you may not have it. You have other team members who have that expertise, and you utilize that as a team. You communicate. Legal or financial might be a stakeholder involved here. Particularly legal, they make the decision with management when to advise there's been a data breach. Laws and regulations. You see how this starts to tie together. Forensics. This is becoming more and more daily. Well, actually, let me just say weekly, more and more required skills, forensics. If you're interested in forensics, this slide doesn't do it justice. There's a lot more to it. Digital forensics, to be a certified computer examiner, it's quite lengthy. Myself and a colleague, we've been through the course to prepare us to be certified computer examiners. We're nowhere near there yet. But there are lots of aspects about forensics. Remember, I was talking about data remnants, using forensics tool to examine the disk that all clusters and sectors have indeed been addressed. Overwriting, encryption, yes. There's an identification, there's a formal process of collecting evidence. You're starting a chain of custody. So much to talk about here, not enough time. Right? Identifying, labeling, recording and acquiring data, preserving the original and using the copies of the original for your analysis. You keep the original, it's time in court, it's evidence. And then you're going to present that evidence. There's a format. Could be criminal, civil, administrative or regulatory, even legal reasons for it. It's not always about crime, but it might be something civil or legal. It needs to be looked at. Whole process, a lot of ISOs around this. Right? There's an entire course that we have at ALC about not only about forensics, but also as part of cybersecurity. E-discovery, right? Ties in with forensics. E-discovery, so this is a subpoena, court order or a warrant from a public or law enforcement, military or intelligence, requesting data, digital data. Send us all the digital data you've got stored on Chris Evans for the last 5 years. Right? Most of the e-discovery don't care about how long it takes or how much it costs you to store it. And you may have to store it for a long, long time if it's something criminal until all appeals have been exhausted. And even then you'll ask a judge, can we now delete it? Otherwise it's long-term storage. Assessments, regional, countries, the National Cybersecurity Agency and the Malaysian government, Australia's government cybersecurity agency through the Signals Directorate, New Zealand CERT, CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency. Every country has one. Why would be important? Maybe your business interacts with another foreign country. What does that foreign country have about rules and regulations, privacy? You need to think about and look at those. And if they haven't been addressed, legal might be your best friends in this case. So there's lots of ways to identify the cybersecurity strengths of your business, understand the areas where your business can improve, and then how to improve it and where. Where to find help, agencies. Testing comes back to security assurance, testing the applications, testing those controls, testing the firewall, web applications, lots of different ways to do that. Security assurance, vulnerability assessments. These can be used before the hardware software is deployed into production. You can look for the vulnerabilities. Lots of free tools, as you can see, available. When we look at penetration testing, Kali Linux. Who likes command line? I've asked that before. Vulnerability assessment and penetration testing command line. Now, vulnerability assessment is about security assurance. Penetration testing, you're simulating a cyber attack. That's the red team. Yes. Lots of ISO controls around this, specifically in ISO 27001, Annex 12.6.1. There's aspects in there about penetration testing. There's other older ones as well. Penetration testing is becoming more and more a requirement on site. It's a skill, it's something to look to. A path, a career. This could be penetration testing. Command line, worthwhile. Some regional threats that are being faced in Asia Pacific. This slide came from Verizon. Every year, Verizon in the US publish a data breach investigation report. You want to get you can search for that, or Eng at Infotrek will happily help you find that. Training and awareness, this is where you come into it. Skills and resources. What path do you want? There's an aspect in there about awareness of passwords. Passwords like a toothbrush. This was used in Australia for a particular Queensland department. But do you have an aspect about policies and standards of passwords? How do you test that? How do you validate it? How do you find those violations? Engineering attacks. Now, this is where Infotrek can help you more. I'm not going to talk a great deal about this, which I can, and Eng knows that I can talk for quite a long time. But there's a whole aspects of social engineering, but really what of interest to you is your professional development. Within Malaysia, there's the global ACE scheme, Global Accreditation Cybersecurity Education. This is getting skills and resources, your career path, looking at there. There's a formula process in there. Forensics covered in here. Right? So under the training, you can be certified in digital forensics, an auditor, pen tester, penetration tester, pen testing, cybersecurity domain training, competency training, Infotrack again, ALC. We also have these training aspects as well. Official certifications that come from ISC Squared, a US-based company. ISC Squared, it's the International Information Systems Security Certificate Consortium. I know, yeah. ISACA, they used to be in auditing, but now they're just simply called ISACA. So CISP, Security Professional. CCSP, Cloud Security Professional. SSLP, Software Lifecycle Policy. We teach these at ALC training. ISACA, SABSA. Anyone here from a bank, big bank? You've got SABSA certified architects in there, useful for your projects. You can engage SABSA architects if you're not within your business or your agency, you can find them. ISO 27001, vendor specific. Eng, I'll come to the end of the session.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you very much for your wonderful sharing.
I'll stop presenting now. There we go.
Okay, actually, there's a few questions from the floor. So are you ready to take the questions?
Okay.
Okay, let's start with the first one. The question is, most of us today use cloud service for personal or professional needs. Hacking cloud platform to steal user data has been keep happening. So is there any tips from Chris to prevent or minimize this thing happen?
Sure, and for further information, Eng and his team can help you. The Cloud Security Alliance, for many years, they've published the egregious 11, easy to remember. Cloud Security Alliance, Pandemic 11. They look at all aspects of cloud threats to security. Number one is the credentials. They're stored somewhere and not storing them appropriately, not encrypting them. So my number one is about insufficient controls, security controls around user credentials. Don't forget about storing it. They're also in web applications as well. But my suggestion to keep it short, the Pandemic 11. And if you're not sure what I mean, Eng and his team can help you with that and explain it some more, do some training, come on premise and do some assessment for it. My thing, insufficient protection around credentials, misconfigurations, which lead to broken access, harvesting credentials, and they're in the cloud. But there's ways to address that without going into a long conversation, which I'm happy to do. But Pandemic 11 from the Cloud Security Alliance, that covers that. Eng, thank you.
Noted. Thank you very much for sharing. Okay, the second question is the one that personal I also really want to know the answer. Okay, do we need to install antivirus in our laptop? Yes, that as apparently the audience has been hearing different advice from different people. So the question is, do we need to install antivirus software into our laptop?
Okay, I don't understand enough about your business or your agency about your policy, your security management strategy. Right? I understand it's a technical question about antivirus on laptops. My personal recommendation, yes, it's a control. Antivirus installed onto laptops. Now that creates another question, doesn't it? I think you already understand. I don't spoon feed. I give you links. You'll need to talk to the antivirus vendors because there can be an overhead, and then you need to manage it. Whether you decide, yes, we'll put them on laptops, how are you going to manage them? How will you make sure that all your laptops have got antivirus updates? Who's turned it off and on? And when you see risk comes into this, is there any compliance need for you to have that control in place? Again, I don't understand enough. Happy to have that one-on-one conversation, but part of my deployment on the Microsoft campus in Redmond, Washington State initially was antiviruses, 100,000 endpoints, servers, desktops, and laptops, and then managing it. Why did Chris turn that off? Why hasn't that been updated? You have the idea. So it's not so much the conversation, should we put it on there, it's how you manage it, how we maintain that compliance and governance and risk about it. And again, I'd like to know more, but Eng, my subjective would be yes onto the laptops, but now you need to assess how you manage it. That's your real question. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you for the sharings. Okay. The other question from the floor is, when it's come to ransomware, how do we mitigate the impact if we are affected?
Oh, that's a good question. In 2018, ransomware, the dwell time, how long did they stay in your system before they pounced? And that was like 170 days. Just recently, I saw something November of last year. It's down to 17 days in your system before they pounce. They want money. And they're no longer going after big business. They're now going after small and medium. How do you address that? Well, you need to look at unusual activity. Great, you have aspects. There's a lot of times here. And again, I don't understand enough about your business, but subjectively, do you have observability into your users, their activities? I'm careful about privacy. But for example, can users log in? How many times before unsuccessful entering the password is their account locked? 3 times, 5 times, or there is no history? Next, privileged access, least privilege. Let's come back to that first question I got. I looked at the pandemic 11. This can also be used on premise as well. So how can you be, first of all, how do you know you've got ransomware? You probably already have. How will you detect it? You need to look at detection or prevention systems that have components of artificial intelligence built into it that can alert you to unusual activity from user, network, and data. User network data, come back to confidentiality, integrity, availability. Thanks, Eng. There's more, but yes. Yep.
Thank you. That was a great one. Okay. Continue. When we subscribe to cloud, is there any metrics for us to refer to assess the security level?
Oh, wow. Cloud Security Alliance. Cloud Security Alliance is used by Amazon, Microsoft, Alibaba, Oracle, IBM, whoever have a public or private cloud. They get assessed and they get certified under the Cloud Security Alliance STAR, Security, Trust and Assurance Registry. Tied into that, two things. Cloud Control Matrix is one, and the second one is an initiative questionnaire. And this addresses, you send this like a spreadsheet. You send this off to the cloud provider. Amazon get thousands of them per day in the US. Here in Australia, data centers that are hosting private cloud get hundreds a day. So it's not unusual, but these are seen. This is a spreadsheet. And you look at your governance, compliance, or your risk, it's already laid out there. They've got 14 control security domains. And then you put any specific compliance you want. I want to put our data in the cloud, but cloud vendor, how will you assure me under ISO 27001 that my data will remain safe and secure? If that's the aspect you're looking for, Cloud Security Alliance, Cloud Control Matrix, an initiative questionnaire. If that makes no sense, Eng and his team will help you with that. And I'm always available as well to help provide any consultancy with a bit of conversation. Yes? Thank you, Eng.
Good, thank you. Okay, just now you shared a bit on anti-phishing activities training. So can you share a little bit more on that?
Sorry, yes. And remind me, what was it again? Sorry.
Anti-phishing activities. Just how you sharing
Anti-phishing activities.
yeah,
Oh, yes. Okay, I won't share a screen yet. So there was social engineering. Two aspects of there's phishing and smishing, SNS, using messages on the phones or smartphones. Phishing. So anti-phishing from that aspect is one, training and awareness, and then looking at unusual activity, because usually with phishing, they've compromised a user. And then they're going to do low level, looking to see this user account. Has this got admin rights anywhere? Or can I use that user account to access admin rights somewhere else and elevate my privileges? So we need to understand how phishing occurs and then how to reduce that malware threat. So again, it comes back to training and awareness, first of all, and then logging and monitoring, looking for those unusual activities. So anti-phishing starts with training, education and awareness, and then using your technical controls for those unusual activities, which means visibility into your applications, into your firewalls, and what the users are doing. Now, this is acceptable use policy, yes, but again, user, data, network. Anti-phishing will alert you to that. This is technical. If it's on premise or in the cloud, you have to decide what can, when I say cost, I don't mean necessarily in terms of dollars, but in terms of time, training and awareness, getting the control out. And then now that control's in place to alert you to phishing, how effective is this? And what's the timeliness? Tying it back to a CM, information event management, or orchestration and automation response. Anti-phishing, you really want to look at automation, something infrastructure as a code or something that automatically locks areas off while you get alerted, because time is of the essence. We've just had training this morning at 10 o'clock. And right now, an administrator's clicked on the link because the phishing email said, Chris, this is a picture of you I saw online. You open up the JPEG and now the malware's in there. So you need to be alerted. How can you address it? A secure email gateway is a great technical, logical control. Secure email gateway. Eng and his team can help you with that and more information. But that looks at phishing, at attachments, unusual things that are coming through that are outside of that. There's more. I'll stop, Eng. Hopefully that helps you with that anti-phishing.
Yep. Thank you very much. Okay, there's another one from the floor is it possible by using an AI chat platform to make a scammer work more real and convincing? How do we tackle about this in future?
Excellent. GPT chats come up a lot now, isn't it? AI chats.
Yep.
Yeah, and deep fakes and those aspects in there. This is still a new technology that I'm still looking at. I don't have an answer for you directly. However, is that to be aware of it. How do you know? You know, we have these 6 questions: who, what, why, when, where, and how, don't we? Rudyard Kipling, 6 wise men, yes. How do we know? How can we determine if this is real or something fake? So again, we have to go back to looking at using technologies. We go back to the source. Where's it come from? Did Chris just click on that link? Was that allowed? Why didn't we pick this up? How do we know? It's getting hard to do that. There are aspects about deepfake and ChatGPT, which is interesting. Google are looking at that. They started this. They should know, yes. But it's becoming more. I don't have a direct answer for you. Something else I'd like to have a conversation with, but Eng and his team are ready about that. But those artificial intelligence chats, it's hard to determine. But you might look at things like maybe the eye color doesn't look right, or maybe the formula, the grammar. English is a hard language, even for me, but the way the grammar might be said in English or in a foreign country language, there's an aspect in there to look at, and you're looking for. You use artificial intelligence again to alert to that. This looks unusual. This has come from an unusual source. This is going to an unusual end user. Thank you, Eng.
Okay, good advice. Okay, the next question is coming from testing team. So they are new in cybersecurity testing and need your advice on which part they should focus when they're building up a team. They're coming up with, they are setting up a cybersecurity team. They need your advice, which part that they should focus while they are building up the team.
Okay, so there's a couple of aspects here. So when you're building a cybersecurity test team, we need to be thinking about how that will feed into incident management, business continuity, and risk. Let's come back to the what's required. So without going into too much detail with application security testing, hardware testing, and so on, there are aspects in here. But in the cloud, there's lots of guidelines and documentation within the cloud from all the public and private cloud vendors around software composition analysis. From there, you can extract skills and resources and training that's required for that, because that's what you're looking at. Nowadays, when you're looking at building a team, you want skills and resources. You want lots of different, here's a better way. Not too long ago, you had this T of skills and resources. You have this horizontal where you had general knowledge, and this vertical single line, that was your subject matter expertise. Nowadays, it's more like a comb. still have this broad skills and knowledge, but now as cybersecurity professionals, we need to have multiple skills and resources. So when you're building a team, what's the skills and resources available to you, and then identify the training and awareness to improve those skills, make them measurable, get management involved, and once again, Eng and his team can help you with that.
Okay, that's good. Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay, the next question actually is a frequent asked question for those candidates that want to attend some training. Okay, so here it is. Okay, I'm from infrastructure IT team, and apparently he's the team lead, and he would like to pursue his certification in IT security field. Which program that you should take? CEH, which is Certified Ethical Hacker, CISSP, or CISM? Which will be your recommendations?
All right. My recommendation, and again, it depends on your career path. Do you want to be technical or do you want to be management? If you're looking at management, the CISM, the Certified Information Security Manager from ISACA, it's a good starting point. It covers a lot of aspects of people, process, technology, the CIA triad. It also includes the cloud aspects from there. I always say, number one, non-vendor specific courses like ISACA CISM, Security Manager. Maybe payment card industry data security standard. There's some standard training in there. You can start with, awareness training just on PCI, payment card industry alone, and move on from there. Or you can go to ISC Squared and look at certified in cybersecurity. That's their starting certification. There's aspects in there. You can ask Eng, ALC training. You can look at that as well. And then from there, you can flow on. CompTIA, Eng, I think your company has CompTIA Security Plus or A Plus or something, was it?
Yeah, we also want to be CompTIA authorized provider.
Right, there's another starting point for you. It's non-vendor specific, CompTIA, the Cybersecurity Manager, my preference. But from there, then you can go and look at vendor specific aspects in there if you need it for project management, auditing, accountability, even if you want to be like managing a penetration testing team, security manager. Hope that helps. There's a lot more. Yes.
Okay. The question is really flying in. Let's pick another last one before we end today's section. Okay. This is rather it will involve everyone, including you and me. Is it safe or not for us to use public Wi-Fi to access website, especially banking applications?
So there's two aspects. I assume with the Wi-Fi access, you're not doing it at work. Or if you are, you're using, under the user acceptable policy, a Wi-Fi network that doesn't connect to the corporate network. If it's just something you're out walking around using public Wi-Fi, between your phone and that public Wi-Fi, there's no encryption. So you've got to think, is it safe to use it on your smartphone? It probably will be, I don't know enough yet. On my safe practice, one, updating this is a iPhone, so it's an Apple OS. My US phone is an Android, constantly updating those. And I have endpoint protection on here. I have a firewall, anti-malware, antivirus. Whenever I open a banking application, for example, once I'm done, I close it. I don't leave it open and running. My sister, stories I could tell you about her, but I close those aspects all the time, and I get little pop-ups all the time. This looks suspicious activity. Nowadays, some people in other countries have a personal phone for whatever they like, and they have a phone only to access their banking apps. Very paranoia, isn't it? If you take the appropriate activities of putting protection on your phone, layers of protection, and you're closing the application each and every time you're using it, and here's the key element, you know the connection you're using from your phone to access the app. Is it through a public Wi-Fi? No. At home, probably going to be okay, because the attacker you have to be of interest to the attacker. That's the key thing. But you still need to protect yourself from threats, phishing, social engineering. Hi, Mom, I've got a new phone. Could you input this into your, and the next thing, Mom, can you send me $100? We know these things, yes. Is it safe with my endpoint protections? I'm not 100% confident, but I make sure that any of the Wi-Fi I'm using, be that Wi-Fi 4, 5 or 6, not 3G, 4G, 5G, I'm making sure that I know what I'm connecting to. At home, not a problem. If I'm going to a business, how can the business assure me that if I use their Wi-Fi, you see where this goes, yes? So subjectively, I feel quite safe with mine. If I wouldn't take my phone to a foreign country and access my bank app though. No, I wouldn't do that. I'd buy a phone and then not do it that way. I'd call my friend or say, do something like that. Does that make sense? Layers of defense.
Yep. So, yep. I think that we already passed 12. So that's why actually we are running out of time. So again, from InfoTrack, I would like to thank Mr. Chris to having a wonderful sharing to us. And to the audience, you will get contacted from our sales team to give you a copies of this recorded workshop videos. And yeah, looking forward to see you in our training or even in our coming sales discussion so that we can find out more of your need and maybe cater the solution for you. So Chris, thank you very much for your time. Is there anything you want to share to the audience?
Last thing, I know you've got more questions than answers, in which case I feel happy because it's made you think about things. Thank you, Eng. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Chris. So hope to see you all next week on our next workshop. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.